Bonjour. Bkejwanong to the organizers of this event and all of the volunteers who have made this possible. I was just discussing with some people at the break how nice it is. This turnout is amazing. I'm used to speaking at academic conferences where there are 4 people and they usually half of them have read your paper because they proofread it for you. So this is a really great turnout, and it really speaks to the strength of the Native communities in this area. So Bkejwanong. I think the tide is turning now. We've talked about different elements of the War of 1812, and now we're going to talk about the legacy, which sometimes is challenging because it didn't end well for Native peoples. But it is important to really look at how that legacy has played out and how it really has impacted our communities and how we're now recovering from that. So, in 1838, Governor David Wallace of Indiana assigned the task of removing the state's remaining Potawatomi population to General John Tipton and Colonel Abel C. Pepper. Settlers were flooding into the area, and the governor feared that conflicts and violence he believed were inevitable if Native American nations lived alongside a more civilized American population. In early September, General Tipton called for a council at Menominee's village near Twin Lakes in Indiana to discuss the issue of removal with tribal leaders. For hundreds of families, resisting removal was the course of action they'd chosen to take. They did not want to move west from the result of treaties that were arranged and signed in the 1830s between the United States and their Anishinaabe kinsmen. When the Potawatomi arrived at the village chapel, Menominee, Black Wolf, Pepinawa, and other leaders were bound as prisoners. The rest of the tribal members present learned that they would remove to new lands in the west in a few days. Monitored by military guards, they were not given the opportunity to gather personal belongings or adequately prepare for the daunting journey. The volunteer militia of roughly 100 men accompanying General Tipton scoured the surrounding forest, indiscriminately gathering every Indian they found within a few dozen miles of the camp. On the morning of September 4th, 1838, a band of 859 Potawatomi, with their leaders restrained in the back of a wagon, set out on a forced march from their homeland in northern Indiana for a small reserve in present-day Kansas. To minimize the temptation for the Potawatomi to try to escape and return home, militia members burned both fields and houses as the dejected members of the wagon party departed. The journey was a 660-mile trek for which the Potawatomi were not prepared and through a terrain to which they were not accustomed. The heat was oppressive, and water was often scarce. They had only a few hundred horses to carry the people and supplies, and promised additional wagons did not arrive before their departure, so even the weak and the elderly were forced to walk. The pace and conditions of the march and the debilitating health of the travelers had a disastrous effect. A day rarely passed that a member of the party didn't die, usually a child, forcing their bereft and exhausted families to leave their bodies behind in hastily dug graves. In the end, more than 40 people died during what the Potawatomi came to call the Trail of Death. There is no single master narrative of Native American removal from the Great Lakes. Instead, these indigenous peoples endured hundreds of removals, each surrounded by circumstances unique to each tribe, village, or geographic area. This opening account of Indian removal from the Old Northwest is specific to the Potawatomi, but is a result of a pointed shift in power in U.S.-Indian relations that occurred after the War of 1812. In the years after the defeat of the British and their Indian allies in the war, the nature of U.S.-Indian policy and the goal of treaty making became increasingly hostile toward Native Americans, opening the door for the removals of the 1830s. Before we examine the post-war treaties and the land cessions and removals that resulted, it's important to look briefly at the structure of Potawatomi and Anishinaabe society to illustrate why early relationships and trade agreements with colonial powers tended to be more equitable and balanced than the post-war treaties. Before the arrival of Europeans in North America, the Potawatomi and their Anishinaabe peoples living around the Great Lakes largely functioned within a society and structure that included strong communal lifestyle in which individuals were bound together by ties of kinship, custom, and mutual necessity. Communities built their villages around clan systems and extended families. Traditionally, individual communities were led by village-approved councils and headmen whose power stemmed from their relationship with and influence over people. Leaders who wielded authority enjoyed the privilege because people respected their opinion enough to heed their advice. Leaders used this authority and power for moral persuasion to create alliances and build relationships and councils and headmen of neighboring tribes. The structure of Anishinaabe society, the existence of a strong warrior society, the sheer number of native peoples in the Great Lakes region, and the superior knowledge of the terrain and warfare tactics conducive to fighting in the area meant that for years the colonial powers vying for control of lands in what would become the Old Northwest were forced to deal with tribes on a government-to-government basis. While European settlement allowed new alliances and lucrative avenues of trade to develop, it also caused new conflicts over territory and resources that resulted in a diaspora of native populations to avoid the detrimental conditions accompanying political and social instability. By the end of the 18th century, the foundations for Anishinabe's social culture were changed forever. Consensus traditionally governed Potawatomi and Anishinaabe village life, a system that worked only as long as individuals who dissented were allowed to leave. New villages were free to form, and tribal leaders who disappointed the community could be cast aside. Infighting, destruction of old alliances, and significant constraints on movement greatly hindered these options, and turmoil resulted. The years of warfare between colonizers further escalated tensions between the tribes of the Great Lakes, their Indian neighbors and settlers, as well as European colonial forces who were trying to make them choose sides. The Anishinaabe and their brethren were accomplished warriors. As such, during the fighting at the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century, colonial military forces sought them out as mercenaries and reached out to village leaders to form alliances. These village leaders consistently made decisions about alliances based on potential advantages that each colonial entity could provide them and their kinsmen. At this period in history, the advantage an ally could provide leaders in their regional struggle to gain territory and dominance over ancient and new enemies was the most important part of survival. The friendship of one village with a European power offered no assurance that other Potawatomi villages would not partner with opposing colonial forces. Specifically, the Potawatomi fought almost exclusively on the side of the French in the Beavers' Wars of the mid-17th century that pitted the British-backed nations of the Iroquois Confederacy against the French-allied Algonquin tribes of the Great Lakes over questions of territory. They also sided with the French in the Fox Wars of the early 18th century over trade routes and in the French and Indian War. During the American Revolution and the War of 1812, as we've seen from some of the other speeches today, some Anishinaabe people sided with the British because they were valued trading partners, while others sided with revolutionaries and later Americans because they believed it would be beneficial to them in their fight to maintain their territory. Many saw it in their best interest to simply remain neutral. After the defeat of the British and their native allies in the War of 1812, a marked change occurred in the nature of U.S.-Indian relations. Throughout early American history, European colonies generally dealt with Native American tribes as separate nations with some legal title or claim to ownership of their land, though they never recognized absolute ownership. As a result, most government officials agreed that title could not be extinguished without voluntary cession by members of the tribes. Each European colonial power had its own policy for dealing with Indian nations. Though the colonial era greatly upset many of the life ways and social structures of tribes throughout North America, in the 18th century, most of the tribes in the Great Lakes region still possessed the numbers, the military strength, and social structures to encourage the United States to continue treating with them on a government-to-government basis. The actions of the U.S. government immediately following the American Revolution offered some promise that the practice of recognizing Indian land tenure would continue under the new federal government. As pointed out by Dr. Belfi just a few minutes ago, the Northwest Ordinance, which was enacted in 1787, stated, quote, "The utmost good faith shall always be observed toward the Indians. Their land and property shall never be taken without their consent, and in their property, rights, and liberty, they shall never be invaded or disturbed," end quote. In 1806, The War Department created a new position of Superintendent of Indian Trade to manage national non-military Indian issues, primarily commerce and diplomacy. In the decade after the American Revolution, the U.S. government used the treaty-making process to satisfy that consent clause in the Northwest Ordinance, while still gaining large land cessions from tribes and furthering the expansionist interests of the new nation. As unorganized lands became territories and eventually states, the public opinion increasingly leaned towards removal of Native people from the land sought by Americans. The Native American inhabitants who refused to conform to new laws clashed with both settlers and civil authorities. While acknowledging Native Americans' unique condition as prior inhabitants of North America, political and cultural elites continued to insist that North America's original inhabitants could not be civilized and were doomed to extinction as American civilization flourished and expanded. Cession treaties secured lands for the United States that were furiously sought by both settlers and politicians seeking re-election, and gave the desired perception of bringing law and order and security to the frontier. It should be noted that in some cases, the treaties did further the interest of the participating tribes as well. Though tribes were very reluctant to cede any of their territory, the pursuit of their land through these treaties cemented the fact that it was a commodity with a very high value. The pre-war 1812 treaties also reaffirmed the tribes as distinct political entities with unique and distinct negotiating powers. Even though the treaties clearly gave the lion's share of the power and authority to the government of the United States, before the War of 1812, no federal officials were openly questioning the legitimacy of treaty-making system or challenging the logic of tribes entering into such agreements. The War of 1812 changed all of that. It was a watershed in U.S.-Indian relations, and attitudes toward the status quo of Indian policy quickly changed in its aftermath. The United States was now acting from a position of assured dominance, and political and public figures began to question the propriety of making treaties with tribes, especially those who had recently sided with the enemy. The first treaties after the American victory at Thames were pretty mundane, and they were agreements that followed a pattern that was common after a military defeat. They were treaties that were meant to establish peace with tribes of the Old Northwest. On July 22, 1814, General Harrison and Lewis Cass, the governor of Michigan Territory, met with more than 3,000 Native Americans at Greenville and entered into a treaty that proclaimed peace between the tribes and the United States and promised that the signatory tribes would lend aid to the Americans in their final push against the British. This was the first of many such agreements made that summer. Between July and the middle of September 1814, commissioners signed 13 separate peace treaties with tribes from the Great Lakes region. A few years later, Andrew Jackson, to none of our shock or surprise I'm sure, was the most vocal figure to question the practice of treating with American Indians. In 1817, he wrote to President Monroe saying that, quote, "I have long viewed treaties with Indians as an absurdity, not to be reconciled with the principles of our government," end quote. For Jackson and other government officials of the era, the treaty-making process was no longer necessary. They reasoned that it was a practice that developed out of the need to enforce regulation and keep peace among tribes that were too strong and numerous for the United States to deal with in any other way. After the war, however, Jackson saw Indians in their reduced numbers and confined by land cessions as subjects of the United States. He urged Congress to, quote, "provide for their wants," but if the government needed it, he reasoned that they had the right to both take and dispose of any Indian lands that they deemed appropriate. By 1830, officials in the Office of Indian Affairs, which was established in 1824, and the general public largely adopted the mentality that all Native Americans should be removed west of the Mississippi River. Advocates for removal argued that Indians and settlers would have better lives if the native population was removed, opening new territory for American expansion and distancing Indians from the corrupting influence of Euro-American society. So they were just looking out for us. And when Congress passed Andrew Jackson's Removal Act in 1830, the legislation had both strong political and public support. Increased tensions between Indians and settlers in the Great Lakes region requested by officials from the OIA, and the outbreak of conflicts like the Black Hawk War in 1832 reinforced the urgency for removal. It was not an easy task, however. Despite the military loss experienced by many of the tribes and bands in the region, there was a great deal of resistance to the notion that Indians of the Great Lakes should leave their homeland. As a result of these pressures from the public, Congress and the President passed additional legislation appropriating monies to hurry the process along. In one case, $20,000 was set aside for the explicit purpose of negotiating treaties to terminate Potawatomi tribal land titles in Indiana, Illinois, and the Territory of Michigan. In 1832, individual Potawatomi bands signed a number of treaties with the government, ceding large amounts of land. But these treaties failed to secure the Indians' removal from the area. Instead, tribal leaders insisted on small reservations within the ceded lands, ensure the retention of hunting and fishing rights on the land, and insisted on payments of goods in cash and property for the loss in their recent skirmishes. In the months following these treaties, non-Indian settlers swarmed the recently ceded lands, and tensions between natives and newcomers escalated once again. The federal government was not willing to let the violence escalate to a level of war. The next year, in 1833, the Potawatomi from the St. Joseph River, some from northern Indiana, and the Potawatomi of the Prairie, along with the headmen and chiefs of the Ojibwe and the Odawa tribes who lived along the coast of the Great Lakes, collectively referred to as the United Nation or the United Band in government documents, signed the Treaty of Chicago on September 26th and 27th. The Treaty of Chicago proved to be a watershed agreement in the dealings between these tribes and the U.S. government. Prior to this treaty, land cessions were relatively small and included land set aside as private reserves for certain signatories. The Treaty of Chicago, however, ensured a substantial land cession of roughly 5 million acres that were inhabited by all three groups around the Great Lakes, and the removal of the majority of these peoples to lands west of the Mississippi River. Signatory bands were given 5 million acres along the banks of the Missouri River in what became Iowa and Missouri in exchange. Though the Treaty of Chicago secured the largest single land cession of Potawatomi land, the stories of the bands that entered into the agreement only tell a portion of the removal experiences for the tribes from the Great Lakes region. Several hundred Potawatomi living in Indiana and other areas outside the territories ceded in 1833 Treaty of Chicago. Some agreed to remove under later treaties, and others negotiated with the federal government to stay in their homeland. The 859 Potawatomi that were remembered in the opening pages of this paper, and who were removed on the trail of death, fell into this category, as did dozens of other dispersed villages in the Great Lakes region. These removals and the dozens of others that occurred in the 1830s were the result of a sea change in U.S.-Indian relations that occurred after the War of 1812. For all practical purposes, the powerful and belligerent nations of the Old Northwest were neutralized, and the federal government treated them as such. So, once American settlers and politicians felt that they did not have to deal with these tribes as sovereign governments, they altered their goal of treaties from peace and alliance to land cessions and removals. Which